The photograph was worn thin at the edges, soft as velvet from the number of times Etta Baker had pressed her thumb across the face of the man standing at the well. A man she had never met, a man whose name she had only learned 3 weeks ago from a letter written in careful, looping script that smelled faintly of cedar and dry earth. She kept it tucked inside the left cup of her corset, close to her heart, not out of any particular sentimentality she would have admitted to at the time, but because it was the only thing she owned that she was absolutely certain no one could steal from her on the stage from Abilene to the New Mexico territory in the summer of 1878. Everything else she owned fit into a canvas bag no bigger than a traveling salesman's satchel. A change of dress, brown calico, pressed but not new, a pair of darned stockings, a bone-handled hairbrush missing 2 teeth along the left side, a tin of peppermint lozenges her neighbor Mrs. Hartley had pressed into her palm at the door of the boarding house on the morning she left, saying, "For your nerves, child. You will need them more than you know." Etta had laughed then. She was not laughing now. The stagecoach smelled of sweat and horse and something older, something like the territory itself, like red dust and dried sage and the bones of things that had not survived the crossing. There were 3 other passengers. A dry goods merchant from Missouri who slept with his chin on his chest for most of the journey. A minister's wife with a rosary and an expression that suggested she found both Etta and the landscape equally godless. And a man of perhaps 50 with leathered skin and quiet eyes who had looked at Etta once when she boarded at the relay station, looked at her canvas bag, looked at her face, and said nothing at all, which she had found more comforting than any conversation. She pulled the photograph out now, holding it in both hands in her lap, tilting it toward the thin strip of light coming through the dust-filmed window. The image was a tintype, the kind made at a studio, the kind where people sat stiff and unsmiling because the exposure required stillness. But the man in this photograph was not sitting. He was standing beside a stone well, one hand resting on the coping, and he was looking slightly to the left of the camera's eye, as though something just beyond the frame had caught his attention in the moment before the shutter dropped. He wore a plain cotton shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a hat pushed back on his head. He looked like a man who had been interrupted in the middle of ordinary work and had not minded the interruption. He looked, Etta thought, like a man who was patient. She had answered the advertisement in the Kansas City newspaper 3 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon when the boarding house where she worked as a laundress had been so hot that the soap water in the tubs gave off steam that hung in the low ceiling like a second sky. The advertisement had been short. Respectful farmer in New Mexico territory seeks reliable woman for companionship and partnership. House already built. Water on the property. Honest intentions. Respond to Louis Dalton, Cimarron, New Mexico territory. She had read it 4 times. Then she had folded the newspaper into a square and gone back to wringing sheets. Then, 2 days later, she had written him a letter. She told him she was 24 years old. She told him she was from Missouri originally, that her parents were gone, that she had been working laundry in Abilene for 2 years and before that had kept house for a family in St. Joseph whose children had grown and no longer needed her. She told him she was not delicate. She told him she could work. She told him she was not beautiful in the way that stopped people in doorways, but that she had been told she had a steadiness about her that made rooms feel calmer, and she had always considered that a more durable quality than beauty in any case. She had posted the letter before she could think too hard about it. His reply came 5 weeks later, forwarded through 3 relay points, and it was 2 full pages, front and back, in that careful looping hand. He told her about the land. 40 acres east of Cimarron in the Morno Valley, good grass, a spring that had never gone dry in the 3 years he had worked the property, a small house of adobe brick with 2 rooms and a cookstove that drew well. He told her about himself with what she would come to understand was characteristic plainness. He was 28. He had come to New Mexico from Tennessee when he was 23, following work, and then, when the work turned good, staying. He had a horse named Clay and a mule named Agnes. He had two neighbors within riding distance, one of whom was a decent man and one of whom was not, and he would explain the particulars in person if she chose to come. And then at the end of the second page, in letters slightly larger than the rest, he had written, "I do not intend to mislead you in any particular. This is hard country. It is also, I believe, honest country. I have enclosed a photograph so that you will know the face of the man you are considering. If you decide not to come, I will understand. If you do come, I promise you will not be made to regret the journey." The photograph had been wrapped in a square of brown paper, tied with a length of twine. Etta had unwrapped it at the kitchen table of the boarding house with her hands that smelled of lye soap, and she had looked at the man standing at the well for a long time. Then she had written back and said she would come. The stagecoach lurched over a rut in the road, and the minister's wife made a small sound of displeasure and clutched her rosary more firmly. Etta tucked the photograph back inside her dress and looked out the window at the land that was opening up around her, wide and red and enormous, the kind of landscape that made you feel simultaneously very small and strangely, inexplicably free. She had arrived in Cimarron by late afternoon the following day, stepping down from the stage into a main street that was exactly what she had imagined and nothing like what she had imagined. She had pictured something raw, half-constructed, violent at the edges. What she found was a town in the middle of becoming something. There was a general store with a painted sign, a hotel of 2 stories with a porch, a livery stable that smelled powerfully of horses and fresh straw, a saloon, naturally, from which came the thin sound of a piano being played by someone who had learned most of the right notes, children in the street, a woman sweeping the steps of what appeared to be a dressmaker's shop, a dog of uncertain breed and great dignity sitting in the middle of the road, apparently regarding the stage with professional interest. Etta stood with her canvas bag and looked up and down the street. She had written to Louis Dalton 2 weeks before her departure, giving him the date and approximate time of the stage's arrival. She had received no confirmation of whether he had received that letter, because there had not been time for a reply to reach her before she left. So she stood in the afternoon light of Cimarron, New Mexico territory, with the smell of dust and sage and horse sweat all around her, and waited to see if a man she had never met was going to appear. 15 minutes passed. She watched a man in an apron come out of the general store and carry a barrel around the side of the building. She watched 2 riders come into town from the north and tie their horses at the rail outside the saloon. She watched the dog get up, turn around twice, and lie back down in what appeared to be the exact same spot. Then she saw him. He came from the direction of the livery, walking with a long, unhurried stride, and even at a distance in the shifting afternoon light, she recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he wore his hat pushed back slightly, the particular quality of his attention, which was directed entirely at her with a focused, careful stillness, as though he were reading something important and did not want to get any of it wrong. He was taller than she had expected. That was her first thought. The photograph had not communicated the particular economy of him, the way he took up exactly the space he needed and no more. He wore the same kind of plain cotton shirt, darker with the day's work, the sleeves rolled up in the same manner as in the photograph. His face was tanned deep as the land around him, with lines around his eyes from squinting into a sun that was not gentle to anyone who lived under it. He stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at her face with the same directness with which she had looked at his photograph 100 times, and there was no awkwardness in it, only attention. "Etta Baker," he said. "Louis Dalton," she said, a beat of silence. Then quietly, unexpectedly, the left corner of his mouth moved upward. "You made it," he said. "I said I would," she said. He looked at her canvas bag. He looked back at her face. He said, "I'll take that," reaching for the bag, and she let him take it, and they stood there for one more moment in the last of the afternoon sun, strangers who were something more than strangers, looking at each other with the careful attention of people who understand they are at the beginning of something they cannot entirely predict. "The horse is at the livery," he said. It's an hour's ride out to the property. Are you up to it tonight, or would you rather put up at the hotel? She considered this. She thought about the canvas bag she no longer had to carry, and the man who had simply taken it without ceremony, and the land out there that was waiting. "I'm up to it," she said. He nodded. No surprise, no particular approval, just acknowledgement, as though she had confirmed something he had already believed to be true. He said, "Then come on." And they walked together toward the livery stable, two people who had decided, each separately and then together, to try something difficult and hopeful in a hard country that rewarded exactly those qualities. The ride out to the property in the early dark was one of the most quietly extraordinary experiences of Etta Baker's life, though she could not have said precisely why. She rode the mule Agnes, who was not young but was steady, while Louis rode his bay horse Clay alongside at a pace that was considerate of the mule and also of the darkness gathering around them. The sky above the territory was a thing that had to be seen to be understood. The stars came out like something being uncovered, layer beneath layer, until the entire bowl of the sky was so thick with light that it felt almost audible. She had not said much since they left the livery. Neither had he. But the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt inhabited. When she saw the house for the first time, it was by starlight and the glow of a lamp Louis had left burning inside, its warmth visible through a single window like a small, patient welcome. The adobe was low and solid against the landscape, already becoming part of it, the way things built with the right intention in the right place always eventually did. There was a corral to the left where two horses moved in the dimness. To the right, she could hear water and understood without being told that it was the spring he had mentioned in his letter. He helped her down from the mule without fuss, his hand steady at her waist for exactly the moment required and no longer. He unsaddled both animals and turned them into the corral and latched the gate, and then he held the door of the house open for her, and she stepped inside. The house was clean. This was the first thing she noticed, and the thing she would remember thinking about for a long time afterward, because she had not expected it. It was a man living alone in a two-room adobe in the territory, and she had quietly prepared herself for a certain degree of disorder. But the main room was swept, the cookstove polished, the two mismatched chairs drawn up to a table that had a cloth on it, a plain one but clean, and on the table there was a tin plate covered with a cloth, and when she looked at it he said from behind her, "I thought you might be hungry. It's just bread and salt pork and it won't be warm now, but it's there." She turned around and looked at him standing in the doorway, hat in his hand. She said, "Thank you, Louis." He nodded. He said, "The second room is yours. I put a blanket on the bed. If you need anything else tonight, just say it." She slept that night in a bed that was a simple rope-strung frame with a corn husk mattress and a wool blanket, and it was the best sleep she had had in 3 years. In the morning she woke to the sound of him already working outside, the rhythmic sound of splitting wood, steady and unhurried, the way everything about him seemed to be. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair back, and went out to the cookstove and found coffee beans in a tin, and ground them and boiled water and had coffee ready by the time the wood splitting stopped. When he came in, she handed him a cup without ceremony, and he took it without ceremony, and they looked at each other over the rims of their cups in the early morning light coming gold and sharp through the window, and something that had no name yet moved between them like a current through a wire. "I can cook," she said. "I can keep house. I can also work outside if you need it. I'm not decorative." Something changed in his expression. Not amusement exactly, though it was related to that. More like recognition. He said, "I know, you said so in your letter. I meant it. I believed you when you wrote it," he said. "I believe you now." He took a long drink of the coffee and then looked out the window at the land and said, "I'll need help with the garden plot this week. The spring irrigation ditch needs widening to carry water to the east beds, and there's a section of fence down on the north pasture. Show me what to do," she said. "I'll do it." He looked at her again with that direct, patient attention. He said, "All right." There was, naturally, the question of what they were to each other in the formal sense. and it sat between them with the politeness of an uninvited guest through the first 3 days. Louis slept in the main room on a bedroll he laid out each night without comment, and rolled up each morning with the same lack of ceremony. They worked together through those days with a growing ease that surprised Etta, not because she had expected incompatibility, but because she had expected a kind of friction, the adjustment of two strangers learning to share a space and a routine. Instead, they fell into a rhythm that felt less like adjustment and more like recognition. She learned that he woke early before dawn and made his own coffee before starting the outside work, and that he left a second cup warming on the back of the stove for her without being asked. She learned that he was not a man of many words in the general run of things, but that when he spoke he was precise and thoughtful, and that he could also, under the right circumstances, be quietly, dryly funny in a way that made her want to laugh aloud. She learned that he sang sometimes while he worked, low and not particularly tuneful, the kind of singing that was not a performance but a habit, a way of keeping company with himself. He learned, she supposed, the corresponding shape of her. She was systematic and efficient, and had opinions about how things ought to be done that she stated plainly when asked and kept to herself when not. She liked working outdoors better than she had expected, the physical reality of the land, the way it tired you in a different way than laundry work did, a cleaner way. She did not complain. She had not come all this way to complain. On the fourth day, Louis rode into Cimarron for supplies. He asked if she wanted to come, and she said yes, and they rode together on the road through the sage and the red dust, and about halfway there he said, without preamble, "There's a preacher at the Cimarron church. Reverend Holt. He does regular services on Sunday and marrying whenever it's needed." Etta kept her eyes on the road ahead of them. She said, "Are you asking me?" A pause. He said, "I'm telling you the preacher's name." She allowed a moment to pass. She said, "What day is it today?" "Thursday." "Then Sunday is in 3 days," she said. Another pause, shorter. He said, "That's right." She turned and looked at him on the road beside her. He was looking straight ahead, the hat brim shading his face so that she could not quite see his expression, but she could see the line of his jaw and something in it that was not quite tension and was not quite hope, but was somewhere between the two and was very human. She said, "All right, Louis." He turned his head then, and she saw the full of his face. And what she saw there was not triumph or satisfaction, but something she would spend a long time afterward trying to name exactly. And she would never quite find the right word, but it lived in the neighborhood of relief and wonder in equal proportion. They were married on Sunday by Reverend Holt in the small adobe church in Cimarron, with the merchant from the general store and his wife as witnesses, and the minister's wife from the stagecoach who happened still to be in town, and who regarded the entire proceeding with her usual expression, but was present nonetheless, which was what mattered. Etta wore her brown calico dress, which she had pressed the night before over a heated smoothing stone. Louis wore a white shirt she had not seen before, clearly kept for occasions, the collar standing stiff and clean, his hat held in his hands. When Reverend Holt asked Louis if he took this woman, Louis said, "I do," in a voice that was quiet and absolute, the way a man states a fact he is entirely certain of. When the Reverend asked Etta the same question, she looked at Louis's face above the white collar, the tanned skin, the lines around his eyes, the careful steadiness of his gaze on hers, and she said, "I do," and she meant it with the full weight of who she was. He put a ring on her finger that she would later learn he had traded a yearling heifer to a Mexican silversmith in Cimarron for 3 weeks before she arrived, when he had not yet known whether she would come. After the ceremony there was no particular celebration. They shook hands with the witnesses, thanked Reverend Holt, collected their supplies from the general store, and rode back out to the property in the late Sunday afternoon, side by side on the road through the sage. But the quality of the silence between them had changed. It was rounder now, warmer, like a room that had been given a fire. That evening he cooked supper, and she noticed it was more careful than the ordinary suppers had been. the kind of care that is its own kind of language. There was dried apple cake in addition to the beans and cornbread, and he had found a jar of preserved cherries that he set on the table without explanation. She looked at the jar and then at him. He said, "They were in the back of the shelf. I've been saving them since last autumn." She said, "For what?" He said with that slight shift at the corner of his mouth, "Something worth celebrating." After supper, when the lamp was burning low, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face. His hand turned under hers, and his fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that matched everything else about him. And they sat like that in the lamplight for a long time, the territory dark and enormous around the small, warm square of the house, while the stars came out above Cimarron the way they always did, unasked and extravagant. Life on the Dalton property in the autumn of 1878 was not simple, and Etta had known it would not be. The work was constant, and the demands of the land were consistent in their indifference to human schedules or preferences. She learned the irrigation ditch and the garden plot, and the rhythm of the chickens Louis had brought up from a neighbor's farm. A woman named Clara Reyes who lived 4 miles south, and who became, in the weeks that followed the marriage, the first real friend Etta had made in years. Clara Reyes was 32, a widow with 2 sons, who had come to the territory with her husband 8 years earlier from Albuquerque, and who had, after his death from a fever 3 winters past, simply stayed because the land was hers, and she had decided that no circumstance was going to drive her off it. She had black eyes and a direct manner, and a laugh that rang across distances in a way that was difficult not to answer. She rode over to the Dalton property the first week of October with a jar of green chili preserves under one arm and looked Etta up and down and said, "You're the one who answered Louis's advertisement." "I am," said Etta. Clara looked at her for another moment and then said, "Good," as though she had been waiting some time to deliver this verdict and was satisfied to do it now. He needed someone with sense. "Come inside, I want to see the house." She and Etta became what they would remain for the rest of their lives, the kind of friends formed in conditions that do not permit pretense, which means they were honest with each other from the beginning and loyal to each other in a way that only deepened with time. The one complication on the property in those early months was a man named Harlan Goss, who was the neighbor Louis had mentioned in his letter, the one who was not a decent man. He held a claim to the northeast corner of the water rights on the Cimarron River tributary that ran through the eastern edge of Louis's property, and he had been arguing this claim in increasingly aggressive terms since Louis had begun expanding his irrigation. Goss was a big man, red-faced, with a habit of arriving on other people's property without invitation and making pronouncements in a loud voice that he seemed to believe conferred legal authority. He arrived for the first time since Etta's coming on a Wednesday morning in October, riding up to the house while Louis was in the north pasture and Etta was in the garden. She heard his horse first, and she stood up from the bean plants and looked at him without moving. He pulled his horse up and looked down at her from the saddle. He said, "You must be the woman Louis fetched from Abilene." Etta set down her trowel. She said, "I'm Louis Dalton's wife. Can I help you?" The particular inflection she placed on the word wife was not lost on Harlan Goss. He narrowed his eyes and said, "I've got a complaint about the irrigation ditch along the east edge. Louis's been widening it this season and it's drawing on water that flows to my claim." Etta said, "I'll tell Louis you came by. He can discuss it with you." Goss said, "I'd like to discuss it now." Etta said, "My husband is working the north pasture. If you want to ride up there, you're welcome to it." She picked up her trowel and returned her attention to the garden bed. There was a pause during which she could feel his annoyance as a physical thing in the air between them. Then she heard his horse turn and move off, and she looked up in time to see him riding not toward the north pasture but back the way he had come, and she thought, "That is a man accustomed to doors opening for him, and he will remember every one that does not." When Louis came in at noon, she told him about Goss's visit. He sat down at the table and listened to everything she said without interrupting, which she had already come to understand was his way. When she finished, he said, "He's been working up to something since last spring. I've been expecting him." "What does he actually want?" Etta said. "He wants the eastern spring," Louis said flatly. "My water source. He's been claiming his cattle can't reach the river adequately in dry season and that my irrigation takes what should flow to him. But the spring is on my title, has been since the survey." Etta sat across from him and said, "Then we need to make sure the survey documentation is somewhere he cannot dispute." Louis looked at her. He said, "There's a land office in Cimarron." "Then that's where the documentation should be registered," she said, "filed formally, so that any claim he makes in future has an answer already on record." He looked at her for a moment longer and then said, with that quiet precision that she was coming to understand was not restraint but clarity, "That is a very sound idea, Etta." They rode into Cimarron the following week, with the original survey document that Louis had stored rolled in a tin cylinder under the floorboards of the house. The land office clerk, a young man of meticulous habits named Clarence Webb, processed the registration with the particular efficiency of someone who enjoyed doing things correctly. And by the end of the morning, the Dalton water rights were formally recorded on the territorial register. When they came out of the land office into the Cimarron street, Louis put his hand on the small of her back for a moment, just a moment, the kind of touch that said more by its brevity than a longer contact might have, and she leaned into it by the width of nothing, by only the choice of not stepping away, and that was enough. The autumn passed in the way of good seasons in good country, full of work and weather and small daily discoveries. Etta learned the land's particulars the way you learn a person's particulars, by living alongside them and paying attention. She learned where the water table rose close to the surface after rain and turned the east garden into a brief marsh. She learned which of the chickens were reliable layers and which were merely decorative on the subject of eggs. She learned the sound the wind made through the gap in the north fence when a cold front was coming 3 hours before it arrived, which was more reliable than anything else for planning outdoor work. She also learned Louis. She learned that he sat on the front step in the last of the light each evening for exactly long enough to let the day empty out of him before he came inside, and that this was not withdrawal but the opposite of it, a preparation. She learned that he read when he had the material to read, slowly and completely, the kind of reading that left marks on the reader. He had 4 books on a shelf above the window: a Bible, a volume of natural history, a dog-eared copy of a novel she did not recognize, and a survey handbook so thoroughly annotated in his own handwriting that it was as much his work as anyone else's. She learned that he was careful with her in a way that was not the carefulness of distance but of respect, and that underneath it there was something that was not careful at all, that was in fact very warm and very present, and that when it surfaced in small ways, in the way he looked at her sometimes across the room, in the way his voice changed when she asked him something he wanted to answer well, it made her feel something she had not felt in a very long time, which was that she was seen. Specifically and completely. One evening in November, when the cold had come down from the mountains and they had moved the supper table closer to the stove, they were sitting together after the meal with the lamp between them, and she was mending a tear in his work shirt and he was annotating his survey maps, and she said, without looking up from her needle, "I want you to know something." He looked up from the maps. He waited. She said, "I came here because the circumstances of my life made it a sensible choice. I want you to know that. Because I think you deserve to know that the first reason I came was practical and not romantic." A pause. She threaded her needle and continued without looking up. "But I also want you to know that whatever I expected, I did not expect you specifically. And I think you are, in fact, extraordinary, Louis. I think you are perhaps the most decent person I have encountered in my adult life, and I want you to know I am aware of that." The silence in the room was very full. She finished the stitch she was on and only then raised her head to look at him. His expression was the one she had seen on the road to Cimarron when she had said all right, which she still did not have a full name for, but she knew it better now. It lived, she had come to understand, in the specific place where he kept the things that mattered most to him, the things he had not previously said aloud. He said quietly, "Etta," she said, "I'm not finished." He waited. She said, "I am also in love with you. I thought you should probably know that too." The lamp between them burned steady and gold. Outside, the wind moved through the gap in the north fence in the particular way that meant cold and clear tomorrow, and the territory lay enormous and dark and brilliant with stars in every direction. And inside the small, warm house of adobe brick, Louis Dalton set down his survey maps and looked at his wife across the lamp and said, with the full and unguarded directness of a man who had been waiting to say a true thing for a long time, "I fell in love with you the day I got your first letter. Before you ever arrived, before I knew anything about you except what you chose to tell me, which was everything I needed to know." She set down the shirt. He reached across the table, past the lamp, and took her face in both his hands, and he kissed her with the same quality that marked everything else about him, thorough and unhurried and completely present, as though this were the only thing happening anywhere in the world and it deserved his full attention. She kissed him back. Outside, the wind moved through the sage, and the stars burned over the territory, and the property sat solid and real in the darkness, the spring flowing clear and uninterrupted from the ground, the way it always had. Winter in the New Mexico territory was not the winter Etta had known in Missouri and Kansas, and she was grateful for the difference. There was cold, genuine and sharp, especially in the weeks around Christmas when the mountains to the west put on their white and the nights dropped hard below freezing. But it was not the gray, locked cold of the plains, not the kind that felt like the world had decided to stop. Here the sky remained blue even in the cold, an insistent, brilliant blue that seemed almost argumentative about it, and the light was still present and real, angled differently than in summer but still there, still doing its work. They settled into the deep domesticity of winter. The days were shorter and the outside work contracted accordingly, which meant the evenings were longer and they spent them close to the stove in the lamplight, reading when there was material, talking when there was something to say, and sitting in comfortable silence when there was not. The silence between them had become entirely easy, the kind you can live in as naturally as air. Louis was working through the winter on plans for expanding the north pasture fencing, and he had begun to sketch out in his careful way a larger garden plot for the spring, one that would double their corn and bean production, and add a section for the kitchen herbs Etta had been talking about since autumn. He showed her the sketches one evening in January, and she leaned over his shoulder to look at them, her hair loose from its pins, and said, "You need to account for the drainage on the northeast corner. It will sit wet in spring." He moved the pencil and adjusted the line without argument. She pointed to another section and he made another adjustment, and they worked through the plan together like that, two people doing the ordinary necessary thing of planning for the season ahead. And in the ordinariness of it, there was a kind of happiness that was quieter than joy but more durable, the kind that does not announce itself but is simply there, present and real, in every cup of coffee and every shared task and every evening by the stove. Clara Reyes came by in January with her two sons, Tomás and Rodrigo, who were 11 and 8, and possessed of the specific uncontainable energy of boys in a cold season with outdoor work restricted. Louis took them both out to help with the horses, which they received as the great privilege it was, and Clara came inside and sat at the table with Etta and drank coffee and said, "He looks happy." Etta looked through the window to where Louis was showing Tomás how to properly check a horse's hoof, the boy's dark head bent close to Louis's hat brim in concentration. She said, "I think he is," Clara said. "He was lonely before. I don't think he knew it as clearly as that, but he was." The land was enough in many ways, but a man needs someone who sees him fully. You see him fully. Etta turned from the window and looked at her friend. She said, "He sees me too, fully." Clara smiled into her coffee cup. She said, "Good. That's the whole thing, really. That's all it is." The trouble with Harlan Goss came to a head in February, and it came in the way that trouble in the territory often did, not suddenly but after a long build-up that had been visible to anyone paying attention. He had filed a counterclaim with the land office disputing the Eastern Springs designation on the Dalton title, citing an older survey that he claimed showed a different boundary line. It was the kind of legal maneuver that was not entirely without merit in a territory where survey records were sometimes inconsistently kept, and the land office clerk Clarence Webb, meticulous as he was, could not dismiss the filing without an official review. Louis came home from Cimarron on the day he learned of the counterclaim with a particular quality to his stillness that Etta had learned to read. He sat down at the table and told her the facts plainly and without embellishment, and she listened to all of it and then said, "What is the older survey he is citing?" "From 1869, Louis said, "before the territory was properly divided. It uses a different creek junction as the boundary marker, and that junction has since moved in the flood of 1873. Etta said, "The flood of 1873 moved the creek by about 40 feet east," Louis said, "which under his reading of the 1869 survey puts the spring on the boundary rather than inside my title." Etta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If the creek moved in the flood of 1873, there will be records of that. The Cimarron Land Office may have them, or the Territorial Office in Santa Fe will. A flood that size would have been documented." Louis looked at her. He said, "You think the flood records exist?" "I think the flood was real," she said, "and real things leave records if you know where to look. We need to find the documentation of where the creek sat before 1873, and then we need the original survey that established your title, and we need both of them in front of whoever hears this case." He sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her and said, "I'm going to need to go to Santa Fe." "Then we both go," she said. He said, "Etta, it's February. The road to Santa Fe is 4 days if the weather holds and twice that if it doesn't." She said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment and then the corner of his mouth moved. He said, "All right, we both go." The journey to Santa Fe in the last week of February was 4.5 days, the half attributable to a snowstorm that came down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains on the third night, and kept them in a small station house, eating dried venison with a taciturn station keeper and his equally taciturn dog for an extra 12 hours. Louis and Etta sat close in the limited warmth of the station house and played cards and talked, and she learned more about the years before New Mexico in those 12 hours than she had in the months before, about Tennessee and the family he had come from, and the particular combination of circumstances that had set him moving west at 23. "Were you running from something or toward something?" she asked him in the lamplight of the station house while the snow moved against the windows. He thought about this with his characteristic honesty. He said, "Both. The thing I was running from and the thing I was running toward turned out to be the same thing, space. Not emptiness, but space, the kind where you can hear yourself think." She understood this completely. She said, "That's why I left Missouri too." He said, "What were you leaving?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The sense that the life that was available to me there had already been decided, and I hadn't been consulted about it. I was going to become a particular kind of woman in a particular kind of reduced circumstance, and everyone around me had already accepted this on my behalf." He said, "And now?" She looked around the station house, at the smoke-stained walls and the station keeper asleep in his chair and the dog and the snow and Louis's face. Then she looked out the narrow window at the darkness and the white movement of the snow. She said, "Now I am exactly who I want to be, in exactly the place I want to be." He reached over in the lamplight and took her hand, and they stayed like that until the snow eased. The Territorial Records Office in Santa Fe was in a long adobe building near the plaza, staffed by a senior clerk named Henderson, who was not young and not warm but was, in the way of the best bureaucrats, extremely interested in documentary accuracy. When Louis explained what they were looking for, Henderson looked at him over the tops of his spectacles and said, "The 1873 Cimarron flood," and went into the back room and returned 20 minutes later with a leather folder containing 6 documents. The flood of August 1873 had indeed been officially documented. The survey reassessment following it had been recorded in September of 1873 by the territorial surveyor and showed, with considerable precision, the new course of the creek tributary and the relationship of that new course to the existing land claims in the affected area. The Dalton claim, under Louis's name, showed the spring clearly inside the tidal boundary under the corrected survey. Etta stood beside Louis at the clerk's counter and looked at the document and felt something in her chest that was very close to triumph. She kept her expression neutral, but when she glanced sideways at Louis, she found him looking at her with an expression that was not neutral at all. That was in fact the full warmth of him, undisguised. Henderson made certified copies of the relevant pages, signed and stamped, and handed them across the counter with the precision of a man who has just confirmed a fact he knew all along was there, and is satisfied that the record reflects reality. They left Santa Fe in better weather, certified copies in the tin cylinder Louis now carried inside his coat, and rode north through a landscape that was cold and clear and magnificent, the mountains showing their full whiteness against the deep blue sky. On the road, Etta said, "Goss will not be pleased." Louis said, "No," she said. "He will likely withdraw the counterclaim when he sees the 1873 survey correction." "He will," Louis said. "Men like Goss understand documentation. They respect it enough to use it against you, which means they understand when it's been turned around," she said. "And if he doesn't withdraw," Louis was quiet for a moment. He said, "Then we take the certified copies to the hearing and we show them to whoever is sitting as adjudicator, and the case will go our way because the facts will require it." He paused. "And then Goss and I will likely need a different kind of conversation." She looked at him. He said, "A plain one about neighbors." She said, "I'll come to that conversation too." He looked at her. He said, "I know you will." She said, "I mean it." He said, "I know that too." The counterclaim hearing was scheduled for mid-March before the Cimarron magistrate, a steady man named Judge Calloway, who was known in the territory as someone who read every document put before him, which was not universally true of territorial magistrates, but was entirely true of this one. Goss appeared with a lawyer, a smooth man from Raton who wore a city coat, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had found that confidence itself frequently won arguments in territorial settings. Louis appeared with Etta, and the certified copies from Santa Fe, and no lawyer at all. The smooth lawyer presented Goss's case with considerable skill, emphasizing the 1869 survey and the disputed boundary, and he was good at his work. Then Louis stood up and placed the certified copies from the Santa Fe Territorial Records Office on the magistrate's bench and said, in his plain and quiet way, "These are the official territorial survey corrections from September 1873 following the Cimarron flood. They show the creek's current course and the relationship of that course to my tidal boundary. The spring that is in dispute falls within my claim under the corrected survey, which supersedes the 1869 document." Calloway read every document. This took 20 minutes, during which the room was entirely quiet except for the sound of pages turning. Then Calloway set the papers down and looked at Harlan Goss and said, "The counterclaim is without merit under the territorial record. It is dismissed." The smooth lawyer opened his mouth. Calloway said, "Mr. Lawson, I have read every document on this bench. The 1873 correction is clear and properly certified. I suggest you advise your client accordingly." Goss sat at the back of the room with the particular stillness of a man who has been publicly wrong in a matter he intended to win. He did not look at Louis. He did not look at Etta. When the session ended and people moved toward the door, He walked out ahead of all of them and mounted his horse and rode out of Cimarron without speaking to anyone. Outside the magistrate's building, Clara Reyes, who had come into town specifically to be present, embraced Etta with vigor and said, "I knew it. I knew it as soon as you walked back from Santa Fe with that tin cylinder. Nobody carries a tin cylinder like that without winning." Louis shook hands with Clarence Webb from the land office, who had come to the hearing out of professional interest and who said, "Properly done, Mr. Dalton. Proper documentation will always defeat speculation." Louis said, "It was my wife's idea to go to Santa Fe." Etta said, "It was a joint idea." Louis said, "No, it wasn't." Clara laughed her ringing laugh and several horses at the rail turned their heads. As they rode home that afternoon through the early spring landscape, the sage showing its first new growth, the smell of the land waking up again coming clear and good through the cold air, Louis reached across the space between their horses and took her hand for a moment. She turned to look at him. He was looking straight ahead, but there was a particular quality of satisfaction in the set of his face, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from doing a necessary thing correctly and knowing it. He said without turning, "Thank you," she said. "You did the work." He said, "You had the idea, planned the route, sat in a snowstorm without complaint, found the clerk in Santa Fe, identified the flood records, and presented yourself in that hearing room with more composure than any lawyer I have observed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When you put it like that, we make a very good team." He turned then and looked at her with the full warmth. He said, "We do." They did not see Harlan Goss at any close distance again after the hearing. He continued to run his operation to the northeast and they continued theirs, and the eastern spring flowed uncontested, and the boundary between them was respected from that day, which was, in the end, what the land had required all along. Spring came to the territory with the extravagance that spring in that country always showed, as though making amends for the severity of winter. The new garden plot was put in according to Louis's revised plans, with the drainage adjustment Etta had noted on the northeast corner, and it went in well. The corn came up in rows that were straight enough to satisfy even Louis's systematic eye. The bean plants climbed their poles with purpose. The kitchen herb section flourished in the corner nearest the house wall where it caught the south-facing warmth. And the smell of it in the mornings when Etta went out to pick what she needed was one of the small daily pleasures she had come to depend on in the way you depend on things that are reliably good. One morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, she thought about the photograph. She had not looked at it in some time, which was not because she had forgotten it, but because it no longer occupied the central position it had held in those weeks of uncertainty before the journey. It had served its purpose beautifully. It had shown her a face she could trust before she had any right to trust it, and it had been right about what it showed her. She went to the corner of the second room where her canvas bag still lived on a shelf, more as a reminder than out of necessity, and found the photograph inside the folded square of brown paper and the twine. She unwrapped it and looked at it one more time. The man at the well, the hand on the coping, the hat pushed back, the look slightly off to the left as though something had caught his attention. She was still looking at it when she heard him come in from the morning work, the particular sound of his footsteps on the threshold. She called out, "Come here a moment." He appeared in the doorway of the second room. She turned and held out the photograph. He looked at it. He said, "Where did you get that?" She said, "You sent it to me in the brown paper with the twine." He took it from her and looked at it for a moment in the way of a man examining an earlier version of himself. He said, "I remember. I had Clarence Webb take it. I didn't like sitting for it, so I stood up." She said, "What were you looking at?" "Just to the left of the camera." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Agnes had gotten into the yard and was eating the young beans. I was looking at Agnes." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that starts from somewhere low and rises, the kind that came easily to her now, and he looked at her while she was laughing with an expression that she knew very well by now, the full, unguarded warmth of it, the look that said she was his specific favorite thing in the world. She took the photograph back from him and turned it over and wrote on the back of it in pencil, LD at the well, spring 1878. And below that, this brought me here. She folded it back into its brown paper and put it on the shelf above the window, between the Bible and the natural history volume, where it stayed for the rest of their lives. She learned she was expecting a child in late May of 1879, confirmed by Clara Reyes, who had attended enough births in the territory to be entirely reliable on the subject and who received the news with her characteristic direct satisfaction. She said, December, most likely. Good time. The worst of the summer heat will be over. Etta told Louis that evening. He was at the table with his survey maps and she sat down across from him and said, Clara thinks December. He looked up from the maps. His expression moved through several things in rapid succession. Surprise first and then something much warmer and then a particular kind of solemnity. The kind that comes with understanding that a thing is real and significant and requires the full acknowledgement of a person who takes real and significant things seriously. He said, Are you well? She said, I'm perfectly well. I've been well for weeks, I just wasn't certain until recently. He said, Etta. She said, Yes. He came around the table and took both her hands and held them. He looked at her face with the attentiveness that was the particular quality of him that she loved most, the quality of being fully present for whatever was happening, of not letting the significant thing pass by without being seen entirely. He said, I want to say something and I want to say it well. She waited. He said, I know you came to the territory with nothing except the intention to build something. I know how much courage that took and how much you have already done since you came. I want you to know that whatever comes next, you will not do any of it alone, not any of it. Her hands tightened on his. She said, I know that. He said, I love you very much. More than I am generally good at saying. She said, you say it exactly enough. He raised her hands and kissed them, one and then the other, with the care that was the signature of everything he did. And she thought of the photograph on the shelf and the boarding house in Abilene and the stage road, and the evening she had first arrived and seen the lamp burning in the window, and she thought, yes, this is what all of that was moving toward. The summer of 1879 was hot and full, and the garden produced extravagantly, more than they could use immediately, and Etta spent the hot August weeks preserving with Clara's help. The two of them working in the kitchen, while Clara's boys Tomás and Rodrigo ran in and out, and Louis and Rodrigo's increasing assistance kept the outside work moving. She grew heavier and slower, and she did not like the slowness, but she accepted it with the same practical patience she brought to everything, adjusting the work to what she could manage and not apologizing for the adjustment. Louis watched over her with a careful attention that never became smothering, which was exactly the right balance, and she told him so. He said, I'm watching, but I trust you to know your own limits. She said, my limits are considerably further than you think. He said, I know, I'm watching anyway. On the morning of December 4th, in a process attended by Clara Reyes and the Cimarron midwife, a woman of considerable competence named Margaret Hollies, Etta Baker Dalton delivered a son. He was born just after dawn, in the time when the territory light came in through the window gold and slanted, and he arrived with the characteristic conviction of someone who has been waiting long enough and has decided to proceed regardless. He was, as newborns go, not particularly beautiful in the way that stopped you immediately, but he had his father set to his jaw even at that first hour, a quality of patient determination that was entirely recognizable. And he had his mother's eyes, gray-green and very alert, looking at the world with the attention of someone who intends to understand it thoroughly. Louis came into the room when Margaret Hollies called him, and stood beside the bed where Etta lay with the baby against her chest, and he looked at both of them with the expression she would eventually decide was the fullest version she ever saw of the thing she had been unable to name since the road to Cimarron. It was love without reservation or economy. It was the entire man present in every particular. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand very gently on the baby's back and looked at Etta and said, quietly, "You are remarkable," she said. "We should name him." He said, "I've been thinking about William, my father's name." She said, "William Dalton. That's a name with some weight to it." He said, "Is that a yes?" She looked at the baby, at William, who was regarding the middle distance with his gray-green attentive eyes. She said, "Yes, that's a yes." Clara Reyes, present in the doorway, said, "Welcome to the territory, William Dalton," in a tone that suggested the territory should consider itself fortunate. The years that followed were good years. Not easy years, because the territory did not offer ease as a consistent feature of the landscape, but good ones, the kind measured in accumulated depth rather than dramatic event. The Dalton property grew along the lines Louis had always planned for it, steadily and without haste, in the way of things built on a sound foundation by people who understand that permanence requires patience. The north pasture was properly fenced. A second room was added to the house, proper adobe, matching the original, for William, who by the age of 2 had established himself as a person of very definite opinions about where he slept and what he ate for breakfast. The garden continued to produce with the generous excess of well-tended land, and Etta expanded the herb section until it wrapped around 2 sides of the house and could be smelled from the front step on warm mornings, which was one of her particular satisfactions. She and Louis had, by the spring of 1882, built the kind of marriage that did not require description to be understood by anyone who spent an afternoon in their company. It was a marriage of deep mutual regard expressed in the ordinary texture of daily life, in the way he always came to help when he heard her struggling with a loaded basket, and she always knew when his survey work was going badly from the quality of his silence at the table, in the way they still talked in the evenings with the same interest they had brought to those first conversations in the lamplight. Because they were both people for whom the world remained genuinely interesting, and there was always something to think about together. William was 3 years old when Etta learned she was expecting a second child, which Clara diagnosed in the spring of 1882 with the same reliable efficiency as before. Louis received the news this time in the garden, where she told him between the rows of young corn, and he straightened up from the seedlings he had been examining and looked at her in the afternoon light with a smile that was wide and unguarded, the kind she saw fully about twice a year and treasured accordingly. He said, "Clara again." She said, "Clara again." He said, "She'll want to name this one too." Clara did attempt to weigh in on the naming, as she had attempted with William, but as with William, the final decision rested with Louis and Etta. The second child arrived in November of 1882, a girl this time, born on a still morning when the mountains were fully white and the air outside was sharp and brilliant. She had Louis's coloring, darker than William's, and she cried with emphatic volume from the first moment, which Margaret Holly said was an excellent sign, and which Clara said was an even better one. They named her Rose, for no reason except that it suited her from the moment it was said aloud. William, at the age of 3, received his sister with the careful seriousness of someone who has been told this is an important matter and has taken the instruction to heart. He looked at her in Etta's arms for a long time and then said, with his father's economy of language, "Small," Louis said, "she'll grow." William considered this and apparently found it satisfactory. He said, "All right," and went back to his supper with the equanimity of a child who has decided the fundamental structure of his world remains sound. By the time Rose was taking her first solid steps across the floorboards of the Dalton house, which she did in the autumn of 1883 with the particular reckless courage of a person who has decided that falling is simply a minor feature of forward progress, the property was thriving in every meaningful sense. The eastern spring had never failed them. The corn and beans provided more than enough for the household and a surplus that went to the Cimarron General Store in trade. The chickens numbered 14 and were, with 1 or 2 exceptions, reliable. Louis had added 4 cattle to the operation, and they moved in the north pasture with the comfortable certainty of animals in good land. Clarence Webb, the land office clerk, had married the previous spring and brought his new wife to the Dalton property for supper in September, and the evening had been one of those spontaneous, successful occasions that no one could have planned and everyone remembered afterward. Clara Reyes had ridden over as well, with Tomás, who was 15 now and growing into himself with the quiet dignity his mother had always shown. Rodrigo, at 12, had recently decided that his primary interest in life was horses, a decision that Louis had taken seriously and was quietly encouraging with the loan of appropriate knowledge and occasionally appropriate books. Etta stood at the cookstove that evening with the 2 kitchens worth of food she had been preparing since midday, listening to the sound of voices from the main room and the yard, Louis' and Clara's and Clarence's and their respective children's, all moving through the comfortable noise of people at ease with each other, and she felt the full weight of the life she had made, the specific density of a thing built carefully from almost nothing, and it was one of the finest feelings available to a person, she thought. That particular compound of gratitude and rightness. She thought about the photograph, not for the first time and not for the last. She thought about it the way you think about the specific moment a river changes course, not with nostalgia exactly, but with the awareness that everything downstream depends on that change and is shaped by it. She had come to the territory with nothing except a photograph of a man she had never met. He had been standing at the well. He had been looking slightly to the left toward Agnes eating the beans, though she had not known that at the time. He had looked like a man who was patient, and he was, the most patient and the most present and the most genuinely good man she had ever met in her life. She thought about the boarding house and the heat and the tubs of soap water and the newspaper folded to a square with the advertisement. She thought about the letter she had written, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands smelling of lye. She thought about his reply in the careful looping hand that smelled of cedar and dry earth, 2 pages front and back. She thought about arriving in Cimarron with the canvas bag and standing in the afternoon sun while the dog sat in the middle of the road and the piano played in the saloon, waiting to see if the man from the photograph was going to appear. He had appeared. He still appeared every morning, every evening, in every ordinary and extraordinary moment of the life they had built together in this hard and honest country, and she was grateful for every single one. Louis came through the kitchen door then, looking for serving spoons or a dish or something practical, and he found her standing at the stove not doing anything, just standing, and he looked at her face and said, "Everything all right," she said. "Everything is better than all right." He came to stand beside her and looked at the same middle distance she had been looking at. He said, "Good crowd tonight," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. From the main room came the sound of Rose laughing at something, the full-throated, unrestrained laugh of a 1-year-old who has found something unspeakably funny, and then William's more measured version joining it, and then Clara's ringing laugh above both of them. Louis said, "You know what I think about sometimes," she said. "Tell me." He said, "I think about the day I put that photograph in the brown paper and tied the twine. I stood there for a long time trying to decide whether to send it. I almost didn't." She turned and looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I thought, if she comes and sees that I am only this land and this work and this particular ordinary life, and if that is not what she wanted, I would rather she didn't come than come and be disappointed." Etta said, "And you sent it anyway." He said, "I thought, she deserves to know what she is considering, the full of it as much as a photograph can show." He paused. "And then I thought, if she's the kind of person who can look at that and decide to come anyway, then she is exactly who I am looking for." She reached up and put her hand on his face, on the tanned skin and the lines around his eyes that were deeper now from 4 more years of sun, and she said, "I looked at that photograph probably 100 times between the day it arrived and the day I stepped off the stage in Cimarron." He covered her hand with his and said, "What did you see?" She thought about this with the honesty it deserved. She said, "I saw someone who was not trying to be more than he was. And I thought, That is either the most honest thing I have ever seen or the most confident. And then I thought, I hope it's both. He said, was it? She said, it was both. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm in the way he had, quietly and without ceremony, the way everything of significance between them had always been, and she felt it as she always had, as the most direct communication of love she had ever experienced from any person in any language. From the main room, Clarence Webb's wife called out that the children had gotten into the preserved cherries. Louis said against her palm, "Those were the good ones." Etta said, "There will be more in autumn." He straightened up, and she handed him the serving spoons he had presumably come looking for, and they went back out together to the noise and warmth of the evening, to William and Rose and Clara and the Webbs, and the good crowded noise of a life that was full, genuinely and completely full, in the way that only happens when you have had the courage to go towards something you cannot entirely predict, and the extraordinary good fortune to find it waiting. The winter of 1883 settled in around the Dalton property with its customary clarity and cold, and it was in the long, quiet evenings of that winter that Etta began doing what she had been quietly thinking about for some time. She had started writing. Not letters, though she was a reliable correspondent with Clara and with a cousin in Missouri who had followed her news from the territory with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. What she had started writing were accounts, descriptions of the land and the seasons and the work and the people she had encountered, the kind of factual, precise, living descriptions that came naturally to someone who had always paid close attention to everything around her. She filled the first copybook by March of 1884, and Louis read it by the lamp one evening while she nursed Rose in the rocking chair in the second room, and when she came out for her own cup of coffee she found him still sitting at the table with the last page open. He said without looking up, "This is very good." She said, "You don't have to say that." He looked up. He said, "I don't say things I don't mean, you know that." She did know that. She said, "I don't know what to do with it." He said, "There are papers in Santa Fe and Albuquerque that publish accounts of territorial life. I've seen them." She said, "You think someone would want to read it." He said with complete plainness, "I think anyone who reads this will want to read more of it. That's the honest answer." She started a second copybook the following week. By the spring of 1884 she had sent a section to the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican on Louis' suggestion, and it was published in May, a full page under the heading Accounts from the Cimarron Country by E. Dalton, and the editor wrote back asking for more. Clara read the published piece 3 times in rapid succession and said, Of course this is what you do. It's so obvious now." Clarence Webb cut the page out of the paper and framed it, and it went up on the wall of the land office, which was probably the most formal recognition anyone in Cimarron had ever received. The years continued to accumulate. In the spring of 1885, William started school in Cimarron under a schoolteacher named Miss Aldrich, who was 23 and serious about her work, and who correctly identified William Dalton as a child of exceptional capacity in the first 2 weeks. William took to reading the way his father had always taken to maps and his mother to everything, with focused and systematic appetite, and by the age of 6, he was working through books that had no pictures in them with the same equanimity he had brought to his infant sister. Rose, by contrast, was entirely uninterested in sitting still for any purpose whatsoever, and her education proceeded along lines more compatible with her temperament, which included considerable time with the horses under Rodrigo Reyes's patient instruction, a development that Louis observed with quiet satisfaction. She was fearless and loud, and had her mother's gray-green eyes and her father's jaw, and she moved through the world with the particular combination of determination and delight that suggested she had inherited the best features of both parents' characters. In the summer of 1886, the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican published a full collection of Etta Dalton's accounts in a single pamphlet, which was the closest thing to a book that the territorial press could manage, and it was reviewed with considerable admiration in 3 other territorial papers and one paper in Kansas City, which seemed to Etta like a completion of something, her words traveling back to the city from which she had traveled out to find this life. Louis bought 6 copies of the pamphlet from the press agent who brought them to Cimarron, and when Etta raised an eyebrow at this, he said, "One for each of our children, when they're old enough to understand it." She had said, "We only have 2 children," and he had said, with the equanimity of a man who has thought about this, "At the moment." She looked at him. He said, "I'm not being presumptuous, I'm being hopeful." She said, "Those are sometimes the same thing." He said, "Sometimes." The 3rd child arrived in the spring of 1888, a son, born in April when the territory was coming into the full extravagance of that season, the sage flowering and the mountains dropping their snow into the streams, and the air carrying the smell of new growth in every direction. He was named for the land itself in the way that Louis had always planned, if there were a 3rd, Samuel, after no particular Samuel, but because it sounded like a man who would be part of the place he came from. Samuel Dalton arrived with an expression of mild curiosity that suggested he was already taking a careful inventory of his surroundings. He had Etta's coloring, lighter than his father and sister, and he made no immediate strong impressions in the direction of personality, which Margaret Holly said was common with 3rd children, and which Clara Reyes said was simply him deciding what he thought before he committed to it, which, Clara said, was clearly Dalton behavior. William, at 8, received his new brother with a measured and genuine interest. He asked good questions and listened to the answers carefully, and then went back to his books, satisfied. Rose, at 5, decided immediately that Samuel was the most interesting thing currently available in the household, and proceeded to sit beside him at every opportunity, which was either going to make them very close or drive him to distraction, and which, over the following years, turned out to be both. By the close of 1888, the Dalton property in the Morno Valley east of Cimarron was 20 acres larger than it had been at the beginning, the result of a purchase from a neighboring farmer who had decided to return east, and the house had grown to match the family in it. Louis had added 2 more rooms over the years, properly and solidly built, the adobe matching the original walls with a precision that was characteristic of him. There was a proper kitchen, separate from the main room, where Etta's herbs dried in bundles from the beams, and the cookstove was newer and larger than the original. There was a front porch from which you could see, on clear days, the full line of the mountains to the west, their peaks carrying snow in all seasons above a certain height, white and permanent and enormously beautiful. The well had been improved too, in the 2nd year of the marriage, the original shallow well replaced with a properly cased deep one that drew from the same water table as the spring, and had never gone dry through any summer since. Louis had done most of the work himself and Etta had helped with the casing, and when it was finished and they drew the first clean bucket from it, he had said, "That will last longer than us," in the tone of a man who considers this high praise. On a December evening in 1888, with the fire in the cookstove and the lamp on the table and William doing his school reading and Rose telling an elaborate story to Samuel, who was in his cradle and regarding her with his characteristic careful attention, Etta went to the shelf above the window and took down the brown paper packet that lived between the Bible and the natural history volume. She unwrapped it. The tintype had aged in the way of tintypes, deepening in tone, the image settling into itself more fully with time. The man at the well was younger than her husband now by 10 years of life. But the quality of him was still absolutely recognizable. The set of the shoulders, the hat pushed back, the look to the left toward the beans and the errant mule. She turned it over and read what she had written on the back 10 years ago, LD at the well, spring 1878. And below that, "This brought me here." She took the pencil from the table and added a 3rd line below those 2. Louis came in from checking the animals, bringing the cold air in with him, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her standing at the shelf with the photograph. He said, "What are you adding?" She held it out to him. He crossed the room and took it and read by the lamplight the 2 lines he had seen before and the new one below them. The new line read, "It was everything they said it was and more." He read it twice. Then he looked at her face in the lamplight, his wife's face that he knew as well as his own land, better in some ways, the face that had been new and a stranger's and was now entirely his and his alone, the most familiar and the most dear thing in his world. He said, "That's the truth." She said, "I know it is." He folded the brown paper carefully around the tintype and retied the twine, and set it back on the shelf between the Bible and the natural history volume. And then he turned and put both his arms around her in the middle of the room, in the warmth and the lamplight and the sound of their children, and held her with the same completeness of attention he brought to everything he did. She put her head against his chest and felt the rise of his breathing and the solid warmth of him and the territory outside the walls, enormous and dark and brilliant with winter stars, the spring flowing clean and uninterrupted from the earth in the yard, the well drawing from the deep table that would last longer than either of them, the land they had made theirs not by conquering it, but by learning it, by treating it with the respect that the good land of any country requires. William looked up from his reading. He looked at his parents standing in the middle of the room and then looked back at his book with the equanimity of a child for whom this sight is entirely ordinary and entirely right. Rose continued her story to Samuel, who continued to listen with his careful infant attention. The lamp burned steady on the table. Outside, the stars of the New Mexico territory filled the sky from horizon to horizon, the same sky under which Etta Baker had ridden into this country 10 years ago with nothing but a canvas bag and a photograph, under which she had stood in a Cimarron street waiting to see if the man from the photograph would appear, under which she had been married and had planted gardens and fought a water claim, and raised 3 children and written accounts that people read as far away as Kansas City, under which she had learned what it meant to be fully seen by another person and to fully see them in return. And somewhere in the memory of the land, a woman stepped off a stage in the afternoon sun with a canvas bag and turned in the dusty street, and saw a man coming from the direction of the livery with a long, unhurried stride, and recognized him from a photograph. And he recognized her from a letter written with hands that smelled of lye soap, and they looked at each other for the first time with the careful attention of people at the beginning of something they could not entirely predict. They had built everything that followed from that beginning. It was, by any honest measure, the finest thing either of them had ever done. The spring flowed on, the well held, the lamp burned, and in the territory under that extravagant and permanent sky, the Dalton family was exactly, precisely, wholly home.